Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Let's start our video with a story about a Saturday afternoon at a sports bar where a clash over the TV channels turned into an unexpected showdown. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that subscribe button, smash the like if you enjoy the content, and ring that notification bell so you never miss a juicy story. Sports bar manager changing the TV. I was at a sports bar watching UFC fights on a Saturday afternoon. It was pretty dead until around 5 when the early dinner crowd started arriving. One family came in and asked their waitress if they could switch the large projector screen from the fights. She came over and asked me, and I said it was fine as long as they put the fights on another TV. The family had the main TV switched to ESPN, which had one of their special documentaries on at that time rather than live sports. Then the family asked if they could switch the smaller TV that I had just switched to the fights. The waitress said no, since they'd already requested another TV. The family was annoyed and asked for the manager. When the manager got to their table, the father demanded that the fights be changed so their son, who was probably around 8, couldn't see the fights since they were violent and not family-friendly. The manager tried to calm the family by moving the fights to a TV behind their son, which I would have been fine with. However, the father demanded that the fights couldn't be on any TV as long as the family was at the sports bar. Then he accused the manager of not caring about young children for insisting that the fights remain on somewhere. The manager nodded and said he'd get the TV sorted out. Then he also asked the father if he should change the music playing since it was pop. The father grunted about that being nice and how the manager was finally being responsible and looking out for children. While this was happening, the manager sent the family's waitress over to put their order in. Then once their order was in the system, the manager switched the TV again. He put the UFC fights back on the main TV, but this time he turned the sound on as well since the pop music could be bad for children. The father started loudly complaining again and called the manager back over. He demanded that the TV be changed again, and when the manager said no, the father demanded to speak to the owner. The manager said he'd get the owner, but it may take a few minutes. The manager changed into a sport coat and came back over. Turned out he was part owner of the sports bar. Now the father really lost and said his family was leaving. The owner calmly asked if he should have the family's meals changed to takeout orders. The father said they were leaving and wouldn't pay for the food the family had ordered. The owner said the family had to pay for their meals since they were already being cooked. The father continued arguing until the owner threatened to call the cops if they left without paying. The family ended up paying but left when their food came several minutes later. Until they left, the father made the son sit there with his eyes closed and ears covered so he wasn't exposed to the fight. I busted out laughing once the family left. Takes family to sports bar where sports are being shown, freaks out when family is exposed to sports at sports bar. And our second story. Neighbor claiming our land is theirs. We're in England and bought a property 3 years ago. It's an old house from the 1850s, and in 1996, some land was incorporated into it, making up what is now our back garden and driveway. This land is L-shaped directly behind our house and extending to the street behind our neighbor's house as well. Originally, our property didn't have access to the street behind, so we had a right of access across our neighbor's garden. However, since the land incorporation, we've had our own access and no longer needed to cross his garden. This is where the problem began. Our new neighbor insists that our back garden and driveway are actually his. Despite showing him our property registry details and the land transfer deeds from 1996, he refuses to believe it. According to him, instead of having a 17-foot wide section of land, we only have 1 to 2 feet. He outright dismissed our documents as wrong. We're at a bit of a loss about what to do. We are certain the land is ours, but his harassment is escalating. Whenever we're outside, he confronts us, and he's been sending us relentless emails, refusing to accept the evidence. To add to the tension, a few days ago, we discovered that our garden shed had been broken into, and some of our garden tools and equipment were missing. Naturally, we were suspicious. We reviewed our CCTV footage, and sure enough, it captured our neighbor entering our property and taking the items. We immediately called the police and filed a report, providing the footage as evidence. The officers took the matter seriously and visited our neighbor to question him. He tried to argue that the shed was on his land, but the police weren't having it. They arrested him for theft and trespassing. The following week, the police updated us that our neighbor would be charged. They advised us to get a formal injunction to prevent further harassment. With the arrest and pending legal action, we feel somewhat relieved, but we know there's still a process ahead. In the meantime, we're also in touch with the solicitor to explore any civil actions we might need to take to reaffirm our property boundaries legally. Hopefully, with the law on our side and the neighbor facing consequences, we can finally enjoy our property without constant disputes. And our next story. So sue me. Really? I was working 40 hours a week programming at my main job, but I did occasional small projects in the evenings and on weekends for other clients. At one point, I was referred to a large company that runs major stadiums and event venues around the country. One of their stadiums is relatively close to where I live. I'll just call them Mark 1 for this story. This manager at Mark 1 said they wanted a simple administration database and user interface for employee timekeeping. Apparently, the old system they had was not working for them. I got details of what they wanted and drafted a set of specifications, told them I could write the system to the specs for $2,000 flat rate. They agreed. I immediately went to work and churned out a database and UI for the system with full documentation in about 2 weeks, so I scheduled an in-person meeting to show them. Now, when I showed up at the meeting, someone representing the security department was there, and he asked about getting some additional features. Sure, I told him I can do that. So I went back, wrote up a change request, and incorporated the additional features into the platform. I scheduled another meeting with Mark 1 for a couple days later. When I got to that meeting, I noticed the audience had grown. There were 2 extra people from the finance department. Can you add feature X, feature Y, and feature Z, they asked? Sure, no problem. So I left, wrote up a CR, and added the features. A few days later, I met with them again. Imagine my surprise when the audience size had grown and the new attendees asked for more features. This went on for about 5 more rounds, and I was getting frustrated that I'd spec'd out a 2-week project that was now taking months, and I wouldn't be paid until I delivered, and they accepted the final product. But I chugged along, implementing all their change requests. But one day, the Mark 1 manager called me. Apparently, she had been speaking with other departments that weren't represented in her status meetings of ever-increasing mass. She gave me a list of dozens of new features they wanted, some of which would require a complete redesign of the core database and an overhaul of the UI. I'd had enough. I told her this is a complete overhaul of the original spec. I'll have to redesign and rebuild this from the ground up. Well, that's not my problem, she responded. Well, actually it is. I'm not going to design and build an entirely new system until you pay me for the current one, built to the specs we agreed on. After a short pause, she dropped a bomb on me. Well, we're not going to renegotiate. You can consider this project canceled. That's not how this works. You still have to pay me for the work I've done. No, I don't. You haven't delivered anything. Sue me. And she hung up. I took Mark 1 manager's advice and went to the courthouse the next day to file in small claims court to recover $2,000 from Mark 1. On my court date a couple of months later, I went down to the courthouse and was greeted by an arbitrator. In my state, they have court-appointed arbitrators meet the litigants when they arrive to see if the parties can sort out the case with an agreement to maximize the judge's time. The arbitrator asked me, "Is there anything you would agree to resolve this immediately?" I thought about it and said, if they pay me 90%, $1,800 right now, I'll drop the suit. He then went into a side room where the Mark 1 manager and the corporate lawyer were hanging out. I heard her screaming that they would either pay it all or pay zero. The arbitrator came back to me with the news, and I told him, I heard, and I'm happy to take it all. He laughed and said, no, they want to go to trial. Fast forward a couple hours. Fast forward's a funny phrase considering how slow the court moved, but hey, and we're standing in front of the judge. I'm at my table alone, and the Mark 1 manager and lawyer are standing at the opposite table. The judge asked Mark 1 manager to tell her side first. She went into a very long speech about the project and corporate America and apple pie and thermonuclear weapons, and honestly, I have no idea because I stopped listening about 28 minutes ago. She talked nonstop for at least 30 minutes. Then the judge asked me for my story. Now, I wasn't maliciously ignoring Mark 1's manager's long-winded tale out of political intrigue and patriotism. I was actually formulating a strategy. I thought to myself, the judge probably had people who liked to speechify in front of him all day, every day. I also thought he might appreciate a short and sweet story that got straight to the point and didn't waste his time. So I said, Your Honor, they agreed to pay me $2,000 to design and build a software system for them. I completed the work based on the agreed specs, and then they decided to cancel the project after I was done. That was it. The judge asked me, how do I know you did the work? I had printed out the specs, change requests, documentation, and source code the night before. I lifted a ream of paper, 500 pages from my table, and offered it to the bailiff. Here's the code I wrote for them, Your Honor. The bailiff came to take it from me, and the judge waved him off. No need, I can see it from here. The judge then asked Mark 1 manager, is this true? She looked like she was in a daze. Yes. Then I fined for the plaintiff in the amount of $2,000. F you, pay me. About a month later, Mark 1 still hadn't paid, so I called the county sheriff and explained, sent him the court judgment documents, and he said, no problem, they'll pay. The sheriff actually called me later that day. He was on a cell phone, and I could hear him talking to the Mark 1 manager. He told her to cut a check for $2,000 right now, or he was going to rip your computers out of the wall and auction them off until the judgment is satisfied. Long story short, the sheriff had a $2,000 check in his hand about 15 minutes later, and it was in my mailbox about a week later. That's why you put a number of dollars on each change request and only start working on it once the money got approved. And our last story. Story about the neighbor that keeps trespassing whenever he thinks we aren't watching. I purchased a few acres with a house in North Carolina about a year ago, and our neighbor has been constantly trespassing since we moved in. When we first met him, he tried to make us lease our land to him for his horses, which we of course said no, for liability reasons. We had our property surveyed with the intention of fencing the property, which unfortunately got delayed since my wife needed emergency brain surgery last year. Well, ever since we had it surveyed, he's been constantly trespassing. It started with him bush hogging a trail around the property, saying it was to give my wife a walking trail. However, we caught him riding the trail on multiple occasions and directly confronted him to stop. If we aren't home, he still does it because we find the horse patties back there. Even since we asked him to stop bush hogging it. He used to mow about 50 yards off the property line to have friends park there, park his semi, and use as a turnaround for his F-350 and horse trailers. We've tried to ask him to stop politely, but it's escalated to him accusing us of being racist for not letting him use the property. Laughable to my wife and I, as we're both mixed race. We've come home to him having parties with well over 50 cars packed into our lawn, where we were clearing to grow our garden. Since we threatened to get police involved to stop the trespassing since he won't listen to us politely asking to stop, he now swears at me whenever he sees me and tells everyone in town that we're racist, among other rude names. He's made lewd comments to my wife concerning my male dogs. If my wife's outside alone at night, he'll turn off his porch light and stand in the shadows, creepily on the borderline. He's also told me on multiple occasions that he's trying to make us move. I don't know what to do from here, especially since I don't have much spare cash lying around because of the medical bills eating our emergency fund. We're in the process of getting a fence put up, and I'm in the process of installing security cameras. We've also had police come very recently for an incident report, but ultimately the officer told me we're going to need to handle this in civil court. I did check to make sure there were no easements on the property and just got approval from the town to fence the property line, including the area where he's been placing rock down to expand his driveway even after we had surveys done. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.